Okay, today what we're going to do is we are going to rig this little mouse that we have. So what this mouse is going to do is it's going to allow us to um, learn how to move an object from one spot to the other. And then it's also going to allow us to be able to animate these this base segment, middle segment, and tip segment to get that overlapping action and learn the wave principle. This is going to be something that we're going to be just doing, animating from the side, just to get that experience and be able to just concentrate on what the tail tip is, or the tail is doing. So, what I'm going to be doing is I'm basically going to be stepping through these instructions that I've made on how to rig this little guy up. And yeah, and so if you want to follow along, you can follow along in the with the description at the bottom. That will have the rigging steps in there. So let's get started. So what we are going to be doing is first thing we're going to do is just to rename. Sorry, we're going to rename these parts. So right now they're just called Geo 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the body, we're going to select that body, and we're going to go over and rename that to be called body. We're going to take tail, this base kind of segment here. We're going to call that tail 0, 1. We're going to go to segment 2. We're going to call that tail 0, 2. We're going to go to the next segment. And we're going to go tail 0, 3. Okay. Then after you have all of those selected, as we've talked about before, you don't ever really want to animate directly on geometry. So we're going to create some controls around the geometry to help move our little dude around. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold the spacebar down. We're going to go to create, to NURBS circle. And I'm going to rotate that NURBS circle in Z, select Z, and type in 90. And we'll just go to the side view. So I'm holding my spacebar down, right mouse clicking, going to the right view. And it looks like I set that back to 0, so we'll change that to 90. The other thing I'm going to do is press 4 so that we can see like the edge loops and see this in wireframe mode. So from the side view, we're going to place that circle of the ball at tail 0, 1. So I'm going to select that circle, press W, and then I'm going to move this to the center. And we're going to scale this thing down to, we're going to click and drag here, and we're just going to set that to 1.72. Well, about 0.17. There we go. It's a little smaller. And honestly, it doesn't matter like how big or small you make this thing. What you don't want to do is you don't want to put it within the geometry that you can't like grab it easily. You also don't want to have it so big that it will start messing up and running into the other parts. So we just want a little happy medium here. Then what I'm going to do is, and I'm also, where I'm placing it is I just press 0. I'm kind of getting it in the center line here, and then I'm going to move it up so that it just kind of fits. Something like that. Doesn't have to be exactly precise. This is not a rig that's going to need a lot of precision on it. So all right, so then once we have that, we're going to do a Control D. We're going to select that, do duplicate, Control D. We're going to press W and then move that thing up so that it is at the center there. Okay, and then we're gonna duplicate it again, Control D, pull that thing up to the center, squeak it down a little bit. Squeak it down. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to freeze the transformations here. So if I look at, if I select one of these, you can see that we have a lot of different information in here. We have the scales have a certain size to it, and the translations have been moved, up in Y and Z. And when you're rigging, you generally want to be able to have your rig, when you select all of your translates and rotates, be able to select all of those, press those to 0, and then have those go back to the original place that they started from, or where you decided the origin is going to be. So like this is where I would want this one to go back to. This is the spot that I would want that to go back to. But I want all of this to say 0 for the translate and rotate, and the scales you want to have be at 1, meaning that they are taking up the original space, or 1 unit. And to be able to do that, what we can do is do a freeze transformation. So I'm just going to select all of these. There's a couple ways you could do this. One, if you are in the general workspace and you have the tabs open here, then there's a little freeze tab, and you can see it says 000 on there. Make that be a little bit bigger. It says 000. When you click on that, that will freeze those, and you can see now these are set to 0, and then the scales are set to 1. If I undo that, another way to freeze those transformations is by holding the spacebar down, doing modify, and then freeze transformation, and that will be the same thing. It's just 2 ways to do it, depending on if you're more of a button kind of person, or if you like to use the spacebar and this middle window. I personally like the hot box controls. They're a little bit faster, and you don't have to move as far. But everybody can do whatever they want, whichever one you want to do. Now what we want to do is we want to rename each one of these. So I'm going to select that first base circle, and I'm going to call this tail. Control 0, 1. And I'm going to do a Control A. I'm on a PC, so it's Control A. It's Command A for Macs, but I'm going to do a Control A and then a Control C to copy that. I'm going to go to my next one. I'm going to do a Control V to paste that, change this to a 2, hit Enter, select my third one, go up here to NURBS Circle 3, Control V to paste, delete, and then hit 3 to change that to Control 3. Okay, so far so good. Moving right along, what we also want to be able to do is control, like right now, these are going to control my tail. I want to be able to control the mouse. I want to be able to drag the mouse body across the screen and have it easily selectable, and be able to get this thing moving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another NURBS circle. So I'm going to hold my spacebar down, go to create, go to NURBS, go to circle, and then I'm going to right mouse click. Sorry, might have been a little bit too fast. So we have the NURBS circle down here. You can't really see it too easily, but if I zoom in, you might be able to check it out here. You can see that line down there is the NURBS circle. If I go into my perspective mode, you can see it just a little bit easier, that it's right down at the bottom there. But since we're looking at it from the side view, and to get to the side view, I'm just holding my spacebar, right mouse clicking, and doing right view. The other way that you can go into this window, if you're not very familiar with it, is that you can go into panels, and then go down to orthographic, and then click on side view. And that will give you this view. So we have our circle. Now, since we're going to be doing this animation from the side. Right now, it's that line or that circle is going to be resting on either the ground plane or something else. And I want to make this be selectable from the viewport. To be able to do that, I want to just add a little bit of bend so that this control kind of comes off of the ground. And we are going to go into the edit mode. We're going to edit the control vertices of that of that circle. So I have the circle selected, and you can see that I have the circle selected. There's my NURB circle. Click on it over there as well. But I'm going to right mouse click on it, and I'm going to go do control vertex. Okay, get that control vertex, and then I'm going to draw a box around these control vertices, or these little dots that are there. From the perspective view, it looks like that, but I'm just going to look at it from the side here. I'm going to select, I'm just going to make a box. I'm left mouse clicking and dragging around that box, around these two control vertices. I'm holding my shift key down and left mouse clicking and dragging around these other two. And then I'm just going to pull this up a little bit. Okay, if that's too much, like if you're thinking that you don't want to have it that much, you could just do the very outer edge ones and pull those up. That's fine. Whatever you want to do, whatever kind of pretty much floats your boat. But I'm just going to grab those two and pull those up a little bit. Now what will happen is that when we go back into object mode, we'll be able to select this and our pivot point will still be at the center. So how do we get out of edit mode? So we got into edit mode by right mouse clicking and doing control vertex, but to get into object mode or get back to where we're selecting the circle, we can right mouse click and go into object mode. The other way that we could do it is that if we're in component mode, which is what this is called, component mode, I can press F8 twice. So if I press F8 and then press F8 again, it will get me out into object mode. Now you can see I can select this thing and it'll still put my my pivot point at the center there. Okay, so we have changed and moved the shape that we wanted. So now in the hypergraph, what we want to do is we want to select all of the geometry and we want to kind of group it together. When we are animating or creating a rig, essentially, what we want to do is we want to be able to have something that's going to be pretty organized. You don't have to do this, but just wanted to show you. If you go into Windows and you go to the hypergraph hierarchy, you can see that right now everything is just kind of like it's all equal. Everything is basically on the same parenting level. We want to organize this so that we have one group node and then everything else kind of cascading down in a logical order underneath that. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to start organizing this a little bit. So I'm going to take the geometry that I have. So I'm going to select all of the geometry, and I can tell that it's geometry by the little kind of like polygons that are there. So I know that this is geometry. So I selected that one, and if I hold Shift and left mouse click, it'll select all of that geometry there. I'm going to select all of that geometry, and I'm going to do a Control G, and that's going to group all that together. And I'm going to rename this by double clicking on that group and typing geometry GRP. You can call it GeoGRP. And you might be wondering what the GRP at the end means. That GRP at the end means that that it's a group. Maya doesn't like things that are named the same. So if I don't know, say like we're making the ball, right? If we name a group of the ball and then we also name the geometry ball, then it's gonna have a little bit of a fit, and it's gonna be like, no, I don't like both of these things being called vol. So in this way, what I'm doing is, if I name something by putting GRP at the end, I know that that's a group. It's kind of like a container for the geometry that I have. And I know that anytime I see GRP at the end, it's just holding something. And in this case, it is holding the geometry that we have. So that's all the geometry just kind of being held there. Then what we want to do is we want to take the controls and we want to organize the controls. Right now, they're all together. I'm going to do a Control G, and I'm going to group those together. So it just took all of those controls and put them in a little container. And that group we are going to call controls group. GRP, controls group. Controls group. And then just to make sure that we have everything kind of frozen where we want it, we have all of our like the pivot points of things. What I want to do is I'm just going to select everything and I'm just going to freeze the transformations on everything. We've already frozen them, but again, it's a good habit to get into just to make sure that there's nothing else that could go wrong. So like if I grab this and then for whatever reason take this and spin it around, and I'm like, oh no, I need to get it back into that position. All I have to do is just select it, go over here, select all of these, press 0, and that thing is going to be exactly where I want it to be. So it's zeroed it out, okay, for the transformations. Okay, then what I want to do is I want to take my geometry group and my controls group. Now, this is something just to keep in mind here. If you have your geometry and your controls group open, you don't want to select everything in that geometry group and everything in the control group. You don't want to have everything selected like that. All you want to do is have just just that top group selected. You just want the GRP selected and nothing else. And the reason for that is that if you have all of those selected, we're going to group them together into another kind of hierarchy group. So all of those two groups are going to be a child underneath the next group that we're going to make. If we have everything selected, I can show you what happens. You don't have to do this, probably don't want to do this. But if I select everything here and then I do a Control G and then open this up, see what happens is it destroys the hierarchy and the leveling of those groups that we made. So I'm going to undo that, and you'll see here that if I go back to opening these up, see how those are falling underneath each group. We want to keep it that way. So if I want to select one group and I want to select the other one, I hold Control and then left mouse click, and that will give you individual selections. If you hold Shift, it will select like everything in between. So holding Control, holding Control. So I'm selecting just the top group, GRP, and then I'm going to group those together. I'm going to do a Control G. That's going to group those together, rename that, and I'm going to call this mouse. And now if I hold if I just left mouse click, you can open it up and you can see that this is now saying that this is the overall hierarchy of the thing. It's a mouse rig that we're making. So that's our top group. This thing is our geometry, and these are our controls. If I wanted to see all of these things inside, I could press the little plus button and it will open all of that stuff up. If I wanted if I wanted to see all of that stuff immediately, like when I open this up, see how we're just seeing the groups. If I wanted to see everything within the groups, if I hold Shift and left mouse click, it will open everything in our outliner. So that's just a little pro tip for you. Cool. So now what we want to do is we want to connect everything together. We want to have the the tail control, selecting the let's see, what do I want to do here? Just want to make sure that I'm adding everything together here. Okay. So we're going to connect everything together. We're going to take the tail control. We're going to take our tail control and then our like tail control 0, 1 and our tail 0, 1. So I'm holding well, if I'm doing it in the outliner, it's a little weird thing here. If I select them in the outliner, I want to hold control. In the directions, it says to hold shift select, but that's only in the viewport. So you would select this control and then shift select the geometry, which is that tail geometry. And then I would do a constrain parent. When you're selecting in the outliner, you have to do it with a control select, not shift. So I hold select that tail control 1, I hold control and then select tail 1. If I hold shift, it's going to select everything and I don't want that. So I just want those two selected. I'm going to hold my spacebar down, go to constrain. I'm going to go to the option box. And in the option box, I'm just going to make sure in here that it says maintain offset. The reason why I have it as maintain offset is because our pivot points aren't lining up. The geometry pivot point is down here, and the pivot point for the circle is down here. If we don't have maintain offset on and hit apply, it's going to shift that over, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to select maintain offset, have that on. I'm going to hit apply. Then the other thing I'm going to do is hold my spacebar down, go to constrain, go down to scale, and we will go into the option boxes. You can maintain offset for that too, and we will hit add. Okay. Now we're just going to do the same thing and move our way up. Oh, also with constraints, generally when you are constraining something, you are selecting the first, you're selecting the parent and then the child. The parent is getting the parent is constraining the child from running amok in the glass shop or something like that, right? So you select the parent first. The parent is constraining the child. So you select the parent first, then the child, then do constrain parent, and also the scale too. All right, so we'll do the same thing here. I'm going to select my parent, shift select the child, and I'm going to go to constrain. We'll do parent, and then we'll do hold the spacebar down again, do constrain scale. We'll move to the next one. Select that top one, which is number 3. Select the geometry of number 3 and do a constrain parent, constrain scale. Okay, so now what should be able to happen? Oh, I also want to do the body. So I'm going to select my body control. That body control that I didn't rename, that I didn't name. So we're going to name that right now. We're going to select that. Forgot to name that NURB circle. We want to call that master move. Master move. So I select on that control, shift select the geometry of the body, and I'm going to do a spacebar constrain parent, constrain scale. Constrain scale. There it is. All right, so what that means now is that if I select my my controller for tail 1 and I rotate that, I press E and rotate this, that's now going to rotate. If I select the next one, that's going to rotate. select the next one. That is going to rotate. Now, one thing that you might be noticing is that as I rotate this, the other top parts aren't rotating with it. The reason why they aren't rotating with it is because they aren't following each other in the hierarchy, meaning that if I rotate this one, it's currently not affecting this number 3. So the way that we can do that is to, again, create a hierarchy chain here. So there's a couple ways that we can do it. In the directions, it says to select the two, select the controls and then press P. Make this a little smaller. To make that smaller, I just pressed the minus key. So you can press plus or minus. The other thing you can do is just press W, and that'll allow you to be able to select it. Okay, so with constraints, I just talked about constraints, how the parent is constraining the child. And what that does is it keeps the hierarchy the same, right? So you can see that nothing kind of changed. We just added these constraint nodes onto our geometry. But now what I want to do is I physically want to change the hierarchy for the controls. You can see that under the controls group, each one of these controls is its own parent, essentially, right? Nothing is in charge of anything else. So what I can do is I can take my tail control 3 and then shift select the tail control 2. And if I press P, you might notice over here, now this has changed. Control 3 is a child of control 2. Okay, that's physically parenting. This up here is constraining. So one thing is telling the other thing how, what to do. But physical parenting, what I consider to be physical parenting, is that it changes the hierarchy and the level of your outliner or your hypergraph. So we have, that is one way to do it, is to add or press P. You select in this instance, when you are physically parenting something, you select the child first, then the parent, and press P. The other way that you can do it is you can just click and drag, just drag and drop. So like right now, if I wanted tail control 2 to be a child of tail control 1, I can middle mouse in my outliner, click and drag, just kind of physically drag it up to tail control 1. And now I have that as a child. So there's, two different ways of parenting things: middle mouse clicking and dragging it up, or selecting the child first, shift select the parent, and then press P. Okay. And then lastly, what I want to do is I want to have the master move be able to control all of them. So I'm going to, I can middle mouse click tail control 1, and then drop it onto master move. So hold shift, and now we can see that the group, the controls group, now have a physical hierarchy level changing, right? So up in the geometry, we did constraining, and there's no kind of hierarchy change. In the controls, we're physically changing the hierarchy, what's a parent and what is a child. So now what happens is that with our master move, since that's the parent here, I can move that, and the rest of these will go with it. If I select this base control, I can rotate it, and everything else will start to move with it. Select the next one, move that with that, and then select the next one, and then move that with that. Okay, so everything will be moving the way that we want it to. All right, so next thing that we want to do is we want to kind of lock our controls down a little bit. So as a rigger, you have your rigging hat on. You want to limit how much access people have to being able to go in and change parts of your rig. You don't want it to leave too many things exposed. Animators will start deleting things or turning things on and off that you might not want them to. In this particular case, we have I don't want the mouse to be able to do any kind of jumping. I don't want it to be able to come towards the camera or away from the camera. I just want it to go across the screen, turn around, come back, and then that's pretty much it. So I want to lock down all of those other kind of controls on there to have it do those other things, just so that we can focus on animating this this mouse and not so much worry about all of the other stuff that's going to come very soon. Okay, so getting back to locking the controls down. So I'm going to select all of my controls. So I am selecting all of those controls. So I selected one control, shift selected all the way up to the other controls. I am going to select translate Y. Translate Y. That's the moving up and down one. I can see what that's doing. Taking translate Y and also translate X. So in this, I don't want it to be coming, towards the camera or away from the camera. So Y and X, and I'm going to right mouse click. I'm going to lock and hide selected. Lock and hide selected. So let's see. Just making edits on my notes here because I forgot to right mouse click and then edit. Do a R T, right click, lock and hide selected. Okay, so I selected those, locked and hid selected. Now, if you have a problem where the geometry ends up, or where the channel, you selected the wrong thing for whatever reason, you can go back in and remove those or get those back by going into edit, go down to the channel control. And then in this channel control, I could find the locked things. In this case, the translate X and Y. I can move those back over to non-locked, go back to keyable, go down to, translate X and Y, select both of those, and then move those back to keyable. And then you'll see that they come right back. Okay? So again, we're taking Y and X, right mouse clicking, locking and hiding selected. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to select all of the tail controls. So I'm just selecting all of the tail controls. And I am going to select translate Z. Translate Z. And I'm going to right mouse click and I'm going to lock and hide selected. Now, the reason why I did that is because I don't actually want any of these things to be translating. I don't want those controls to be able to move outside. I want them only to be rotational controls. So we did that. Then what we're going to do is we are going to create some display layers. And display layers are over here. If you are in the channel box layer editor, if you don't see that, change this workspace to general, and it should be on the side. Otherwise, you might have to click on this little kind of looks like a layer button over in the side with some lines on it, and that will give you the channel box. Okay, so we're in the channel box. And down at the bottom, we're looking at the display layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all my controls, or you can select the controls group here. And I'm going to, so I selected the controls group, and I'm going to click on this button here. Looks like a piece of paper with a blue little ball on it. Zoom out there. So I'm going to select on that. What that does is it takes whatever you have selected puts it in a new display layer, and then allows you to do that. Otherwise, if you hit the one next to it with a little plus, you can see that little add button. What that will do is it'll just create a new empty layer. But I always find it easier to create a new layer and assign the selected objects, just kind of saving an extra step. All right. In that display layer, we are going to rename that layer. So if I double click on this layer, we'll open up with edit layer, and we're going to rename that thing. We're going to call it controls. Now this is where the naming convention kind of helps in having a little bit of organization. So over here we have controls, but this is a group. We can't name everything controls, right? So this is a controls group. This is going to be controls layer. Anytime I have layers, I'll usually add on the end of it LYR. LY. There we go. So I'll have a controls layer. And let's see a couple things about that. Yep, we have, yeah. And then I'm just going to hit save on that. So now we have a controls layer. Then I'm going to select my geometry. You could select all of the geometry, or you can, you could select all of the geometry here. I'm just going to do it in the group. It'll be able to do the same thing. So I'm going to select that geometry. I'm going to click on that, create new layer, and then add selected to it. I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to call this geometry LYR, again, helping to keep our geometry group and our geometry layer separate. And then what we're going to do is we are going to change our display type, and we're going to change that to reference. And that's very important, because what that does is it allows us to see the geometry on the screen, but also doesn't allow us to select it. So we can just, if we wanted to select everything or select just the controls, we can click and drag a box around and it won't select the geometry. So I can hit save, and when I hit save, now you can see that the geometry is black. I can't select it here. Now, when I do my rigging, generally the way that I personally set them up is so that that it's a visual selection in the viewport. You can go over and select these things, but 9 times out of 10, anybody that, especially if you're first starting out animating, they'll be animating on the wrong thing. They'll start animating on a group instead of the actual thing, or they'll select the tail geometry and start animating on the tail geometry, and you don't want to do that. So what I would say is that if you are animating, don't go over into the outliner. Select your stuff from the viewport, and whatever you need to, set some keys on, you should be able to have the geometry locked down and the controls available to you. Okay. Last thing that we're going to do is just create this thing. We'll make a little kind of, we'll make a project. So it's all in one container. And the way that we can make that project is to go to File. We're going to go to, where is it here? We're going to go to Project window. This project window will set all of the folders that we would need for any kind of Maya file that we're going to have. We aren't doing a ball bounce, but we are going to make a new project, and we're going to call this mouse move. And the location, I want it on my desktop, so that's good there. And yeah, so all of that stuff should be fine. I'm going to hit accept. Then I'm going to go to File, go to File, and then do a Save Scene As. When I do a Save Scene As, you can see that it has already put it into my mouse move folder and then into the scene folder. And this mouse move is not going to be mouse geo, but what I can do is I could call this mouse underscore rig underscore 01, so we know what version it is. And then I'll do another underscore, and I'll put MJR R because that's my initials. So that is the way that I would set up this rig. Okay. And then I'll do save as, and that's saved. Okay. All right, so we have created a rig. Then what we want to do is be able to pull that into an animation or get it ready to animate. To set up that new scene, that new animation scene, I would make a new animation file. So you can do a file and then do new scene, file, new scene, or you can hit the little kind of paper thing over here. It's like a little new scene thing. So I've created a new scene and now it is blank. Okay. So when you are animating, you generally want to have an animation file and your rig file, similar to like editing a video, right? If you open up Premiere, you have Premiere, the program, and then you also have the video footage that you have. You don't actually edit directly on the video footage. You don't directly start cutting that video footage. You pull a copy of that video footage into say like After Effects or your compositing program, and then you start kind of editing or cutting that video in the project. The original video is still saved and it's still fine, and you can go back to the original at any time. Same thing with the animation file. You have your rig file, you have your animation file, and you want to pull a copy of that into your animation file. That helps save the it helps lock down your rig file to, again, add another level of protection so that if something absolutely gets destroyed or broken, you can then go in and pull in a new version, or if you need to make updates, say like our mouse rig, maybe we wanted to add some fancy new thing to it, add some geometry to it. If we had a bunch of different scenes with animation in it, we wouldn't want to have to then go into each scene and update every animation or every rig that we have in each scene. So instead, what we could do is pull in that new reference. We could have it say, okay, don't point to that original 01 rig, point to this new 02 rig. And that would then cascade to the rest of your animation. So just makes things a little bit easier for you down the line. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I have my new animation file, and I'm going to reference that rig in. So I'm going to do a file. I'm going to do a where is it here? I'm going to do a reference. I'll go into the reference editor. I could do create reference, but this is the kind of like editor. I'll click on this little blue diamond with the red plus, and it's going to say, all right, where is the reference for this thing? And if you've set your scene up, if you've set your project up, it will automatically go into scenes, and there is my mouse. So I'm going to click on reference. The mouse is in there. There you go. Some pretty cool stuff in there. Now, again, what I said is that by referencing things in, it kind of makes an extra layer of protection. One way of creating that protection is that if I select this rig and I hit delete by accident, you see that nothing actually deleted. I just got an error message saying that cannot delete it because things are locked down and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it has locked down. It's locked to read-only children. So it adds another level of protection. If I were to just animate directly on the rig that we just created, if I hit delete, that thing, that part of the rig is gone. Okay, so again, adds another layer of protection. So we are going to be animating this this thing from the side. So generally, when I'm animating, I have a front view and or not a front view. I have a working camera view, and then I also have the camera that's going to be still. So I am going to go over to the left-hand side. I'm going to select on this little panel layout, and I'm going to click on that, and it's going to split my panel in two. But before I do that, I'm actually going to change this to this workspace up in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to change that so that we aren't looking at general. We are going to start animating. So click on animation. And that animation will then put our graph editor at the bottom. Now I can hit that split and it will split the scene here. Okay, so for me, I personally like the right side to be my camera view. So I'm gonna create a new camera. I'm gonna go to panels, go to orthographic, new, and then new right view here. Okay, so that's gonna be my right view. The other thing that I also like to do is click on this resolution gate. And that resolution gate, what that'll do is it will show well, I'll just click on it. It'll show what would be rendered in this view, and then also gives you a little buffer to show you like what's outside or what's just hanging outside of view. So that's personally the way that I like to roll. Now, if I have this thing going down and then coming back, I'm gonna spin this guy around. Spin 180. So we'll put 180 on that. So if I have this thing going down and then back, I don't want to have it so far away that I can't see it, right? That it's, you know, really itty bitty tiny. But I want to have it in, you know, just such a way that it'll give me enough space and time to go down and then come back. I'm also going to use the kind of edge here and maybe the edge of the screen here as my kind of stopping point in going back. Okay. On the left-hand side, I want to set this up to do my perspective. I don't want to set that to perspective. I want to go to orthographic and then go to my side view. Okay. I don't want to click on orthographic right, because that will just give me the same image on both sides, and I don't want that. I want these two different cameras. I want the right view camera. I want the side camera, and then I also want on this side the right camera. So we can see at the bottom it says right. This one says side. All right. Then, so then what I can do is I can zoom into this and I can move and manipulate this around. On my camera view side, I'm going to select this button that is going to lock this view down. And what I mean by lock it down is that once I get this set, I don't want to be able to, you know, hold my Alt and then move my camera on. You know, if I hold Alt and middle mouse here, you can see that it's still moving. I can zoom in, zoom out. This is going to be what I'm going to see in my animation. All right. The last thing that I would do before I start blocking this thing out is go to this little character that's running for his life here from the gear. Click on that. That's your preferences. You can also find your preferences under Windows and then general editors and not general editors, sorry, setting and preferences, and then preferences will get you to the same area. All right, so I'm in preferences. I want to do a couple things here. One is just scroll down a little bit and I want to update view. I want to change this to all. Changing that to all will update both of these views. When I click on one and drag the thing across, like if I select this and it will move, it'll update both of those while it's playing. I want to make sure that is set. The other thing I want to do is go into animation. I'm going to change my default tangents. I'm going to change that from linear. I'm going to change that to plateau for the default in tangent and stepped for the out tangent. And then I'm going to hit save. Okay, those two things are what I'm going to set there. Okay, and then that's pretty much it. So if I wanted to set some keys on this thing, I could go to frame 1. Hit S, and that will set some keys, set a key on everything there, move it down to the bottom, or actually you need to change some time on there. So if this is going to be 120 frames, I could say, all right, this is going down 60 frames, go down to the end, set a key on there, press S, and maybe 2-frame turn. So I hit E, turn it around to 0. And then set a key on that, hit S, and then bring it back to maybe, you know, it would stop at 100. I want to stop it sooner than 120 because I want to have some time for the tail to be able to move. So go down to the end there and hit S. Now I have my animation kind of going down. Do, do, do. And then finally go if I hit play. Do, do. Okay, so it's the beginnings of my animation. All right. If you have any questions, let me know. And happy ending.